Hi, I'm Dave Hilowitz. So in this video, we're going to go over the basics of analog synthesis, and we're going to do that by means of this thing, the Moog Mavis. It's brand new. It's a tiny semi-modular synthesizer from Moog, the company that started it all, and it's designed to give you an introduction to both analog synthesis and modular synthesis. So let's dive in. In the interest of full disclosure, I should mention that Moog did send me this unit. However, they don't have any control over what I'm going to be saying in this video. First things first, let's open up the box. As you can see, the packaging is really beautiful. The inside lid contains sort of a mission statement for the product. Meet Mavis, your new companion in sonic exploration. Everything is neatly packed. There's a getting started guide which tells you how to build it and what each of the controls does. Along with the pieces needed to assemble the synth, there are 5 patch cables, which we'll be using to modify the way sound flows through the synthesizer. It also comes with these cute patching templates that you can put over the faceplate. These show you how to patch the instrument to get specific sounds. All in all, it's a very well thought out package that's clearly meant to get you excited both about the product and about modular synthesis in general. The only thing that was for some reason missing from the box was an actual manual. I don't know if that was intentional or not. I found the manual on the Moog website, and it's great. It's really detailed, and it takes you through everything you need to know to understand how to patch it. Okay, let's put this thing together. This is not very complicated. You're basically just screwing the front panel to the circuit board and then putting the circuit board into the chassis. By the way, Mavis is designed to be both a standalone synth or a Eurorack module. So if you do decide to get into Eurorack, you can just unscrew it from the chassis, plug in a standard ribbon cable, and use it as your first module. The longest part of the build process was just screwing these little jack nuts on. The entire assembly took me just over 17 minutes. The last step in this process is attaching this label. Note the extremely low serial number. Okay, well, it certainly looks like a synthesizer. Let's plug it in and see if it works. Nice, okay. So there are many kinds of synthesis, but the most famous, the most classic is subtractive synthesis. It's the technique for sound generation that Bob Moog made famous in the mid-60s, and if you're just getting started in the world of synthesis, it's probably the place to start. As you've probably figured out, it's also the kind of synthesis that the Moog Mavis is based on. Here's a diagram of a typical subtractive synth, and it's got all of these elements, and we'll discuss what each of them are in a second, but the important thing to note is that the Moog Mavis has all of the same elements. Okay, we're going to start up here and we're going to work our way around. On the Moog Mavis, this top left area controls the oscillator. This is the part of the synthesizer that actually produces a sound. As you can see, it's labeled VCO, which stands for Voltage Controlled Oscillator. So first things first, if we want to actually have our synthesizer play nice with other instruments, we have to tune it. As you can see, I've got this synthesizer plugged into my computer, and up on my computer, I'm just going to pull in a tuner plug-in, and I'm going to press down on one key, and I'm going to turn this pitch knob until we have a C. There, that's close enough. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about oscillators. Depending on the kind of synthesizer you have, the oscillator is going to produce a different waveform. A sine wave is the most pure waveform. If we look at a spectrogram, which shows all of the frequencies this contains, we can see that it contains just a single frequency, and that frequency is the frequency of whatever note I just played. Of course, there are many other waveforms. The oscillator on the Mavis gives us a choice from sawtooth to square wave, and everything in between. Right now we have the VCO wave knob all the way to the left, which means the kind of waveform Mavis is generating is a sawtooth wave. Now let's look at the frequencies that contains. You get that main frequency just like we did with the sine wave, but then we get these other frequencies above it that also contribute to the sound. These other frequencies are called harmonics, and they're the reason why some waveforms sound richer and more characterful than others. All of which brings us back to the idea behind subtractive synthesis. The principle here is that we start with a waveform that is very rich in harmonics, in this case the sawtooth wave, and you sculpt the sound by taking away frequencies until it sounds the way you actually want it to sound. And the way you do this is using a low-pass filter. By the way, VCF here stands for voltage-controlled filter. The way a low-pass filter works is all the frequencies above a certain point in the frequency spectrum get removed. And this cutoff knob right here controls where on the spectrum that point is. At least that's the theory. Of course, in reality, a low-pass filter doesn't lop off everything above a certain threshold. It's more of a gradual slope. And analog low-pass filters also have this funny side effect that gets used in music all the time. Right before the downward slope starts, there's actually a bump. A small spot in the frequency spectrum where, instead of removing frequencies, the filter is actually adding frequencies. The resonance knob controls how pronounced that bump is. If you turn the resonance up and change the cutoff rate, you can get these nice filter sweeps that are extremely common in electronic music. For a second, I'm going to turn the VCA off. So on their own, the sound that an oscillator and a filter together produce is what we're hearing right now. And you'll notice something about it. It never stops. It just keeps going and going. The reason for that is typically an oscillator will have just one input, and that input controls the pitch, specifically what note to play. It doesn't have any input for when to start and stop a note. Of course, in a musical context, we do want notes to be able to start and stop. In comes the voltage-controlled amplifier, and down here, the envelope generator. I'm going to switch this little switch from on to EG, which stands for envelope generator, which means that the amplifier is now controlled by the envelope generator down here. So, going back to our diagram, we started with this architecture, and now we've got this. The envelope controls how quickly the sound starts, how long it lasts, and how quickly it dies down after we take our finger off the key. Changing these simple parameters can drastically shape how we perceive the sound. For example, if we make the attack and release really long, it's more of a pad sound. Or if we tweak the settings again, we can make these short sounds that are useful for percussive work. And using these knobs, we can actually choose to have the envelope generator control things like the VCO wave knob or the filter cutoff. So for example, if we turn this like this and we turn up the modulation amount, we get a filter sweep built right into our sound. So next we have the LFO, which stands for low frequency oscillator. It's a lot like the main oscillator, the one we use for generating a sound, but the difference here is that it's quite a bit slower, and it's generally used for controlling other settings. It's a little bit like a second set of hands. So depending on where it's assigned, it's as though somebody else is coming along, grabbing those controls and wiggling the knob back and forth at a regular interval. So for example, if I turn this knob here, instead of having the envelope generator controlling the filter cutoff, we have the LFO doing the same thing. And this little light kind of shows us how fast the LFO is moving. So if I hold down a note, that oscillation is provided by the LFO, and we can actually change the rate. So LFOs are, of course, extremely useful and can be heard in many different kinds of electronic music. A cool thing about this particular LFO is it can be made to oscillate really, really fast. In fact, it can be made to basically be a second oscillator, just like the voltage-controlled oscillator. So we're going to explore that in a little bit. So that's the basic architecture of Mavis. In fact, it's the basic architecture of most analog synths. Some of them have more oscillators or more envelopes or whatever, but the basic ingredients are here. So while I was making this video, I decided to read up a little bit more on the history of this architecture. And what struck me most was Robert Moog didn't really set out to invent the synthesizer. There's no reason why it should have been him particularly. His company was started in the mid-50s to cater to his original passion, the theremin. If you don't know what that is, it's a sort of synthesizer that you play by waving your hands in the air. For the first 10 years, Bob Moog just produced theremins. It was only after a chance meeting with composer Herb Deutsch that the idea for Moog's synth took hold. Deutsch convinced Moog to make a new instrument, one which could be controlled with a conventional piano keyboard. This is what their prototype looked like. If we zoom in, we can see that the elements of that system were almost identical to what we have today. We have two oscillators, which can generate sawtooth triangle waves and pulses. We have amplifiers, just like the VCAs we use today. In a separate unit, we have a voltage-controlled filter and an envelope generator. In other words, the entire blueprint for the classic analog synthesizer was already in place by 1965. The very same architecture that we're now exploring on the Mavis. Now, you'll notice that we haven't talked about this Patchbay at all, and we haven't talked about this utility section either. By default, neither of these is doing anything. If you don't plug anything into any of these jacks, except for, of course, the output, Mavis has its own internal wiring which kind of takes over. We need to plug some cables in to bring this functionality to life. Now, the basic premise of a modular synth is that it's made up of many discrete components, and these components exchange information with each other in the form of electrical current. These electrical currents are called control voltages. By the way, it's not exactly information in a sort of a binary sense, it's just a voltage, but yeah, it's a good way of thinking about it anyway. This Patchbay lets you take the control voltages from one part of the synth and route them into another part of the synth, thereby changing the way these components interact with each other. So let's do some patching. Some of these jacks are inputs and some of them are outputs. The ones that have reversed text like this are outputs, and the ones that have regular text are inputs. So let's start with this jack right here, fold in. Other than the output in the top left-hand corner, fold in is by far the most important jack here. It doesn't take control voltage, it's an audio input. And when you plug something into that input, the internal routing of the synth gets changed. Normally, the oscillator is routed to the filter, but when you plug something into fold in, the oscillator is bypassed, and whatever you've plugged in gets routed to a wave folder, which is controlled with this knob here, then to the filter, and then to the VCA. To put this in terms of our diagram, we start with this, and we end up with this. The wave folder is something a little bit special about Mavis. A wave folder is a filter that changes a waveform such that everything above a certain volume is folded down. So all of the crests that were pointing up are now pointing down, and then sometimes they fold back on themselves again, so they're pointing up again. So let's try something fun. Right here, we have the output of the LFO. And remember, an LFO is generally used for controlling other parameters. Like before, we were using the LFO to control the cutoff here. We can actually make this LFO oscillate much, much faster. In fact, so fast that we can actually produce a tone with it, just like we can with the regular oscillator. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the output of the LFO, and I'm going to plug it directly into fold in. Now, right now, we're not hearing anything, and that's because we haven't pressed down on a key. You can hear something now. If we don't want to have to press down on a key while we're messing with this, I'm just going to turn off the envelope generator. I don't know if you can hear it now, but there's sort of a low-pitched growl happening, in fact. And that is a triangle wave being generated by the oscillator. I'm going to turn up the rate. Okay, that's enough of that. Of course, if we play different keys on the keyboard, that note stays the same. And that's because in order to actually change the pitch of that oscillator, we need to be changing that rate. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the output from the keyboard, which actually is accessible right here, and we're going to patch that into that rate. And just like that, we have ourselves a second oscillator. And if we look at the oscilloscope, we can see it's quite a different waveform from the waveform we were looking at before with the regular oscillator. In fact, it's a great time to actually explore that wave folder. Remember, we've patched something into the fold in, and we've now activated the wave folder. So all we have to do is press a note and then turn this knob, and we can hear the effects of the wave folder. So yeah, pretty cool. Of course, now we're using this LFO as an oscillator, but we've completely taken the regular oscillator out of the mix. What if we want to use that too and have two oscillators going at the same time? Well, we can use both. Mavis actually has a little 2-input mixer, So instead of having our LFO output directly to the input right here, we're actually going to have it input into this 2 jack, which is the second input on the mixer. And we're going to take the output from the regular oscillator, which is the VCO, and we're going to plug that into the 1 input on that same mixer. Finally, we're going to take the output of the mixer, which is this 1+2 jack, and we're going to put that into the fold input. Now when we play it, we're going to hear both waveforms. But it sounds terrible. Now, the reason it sounds terrible is because we haven't actually calibrated the rate here at all to anything. So we're basically not at all in tune with the VCO, which we so lovingly tuned earlier in this video. So the LFO is completely out of tune with the VCO. So all we have to do to make that work is hold down a key and turn the rate until it doesn't sound so unbelievably terrible. Okay, we finally got there. Not for the faint of heart. The Moog Mavis has very, very small knobs, and yeah, doing things like that, like tuning it, can be quite finicky. So that's how you use the Patchbay. There are, of course, many other patch points in this, but they are outside of the scope of this video. Okay, enough talk. Let's make some music with this thing. So far, I've been using this cute little keyboard to control the synth. It's very nice for getting a sense of what the current settings sound like, but because it's literally just 1 octave, it's actually pretty limited. Ultimately, when I'm using this in my own setup, I'm planning to control it using an Arturia key step. It's worth noting that Mavis does not have MIDI or USB input, so if you're planning on hooking it up to a computer or even to a keyboard, you'll want something with CV outputs. A key step can be found used for about $100, and it can act either as a controller or as a USB or MIDI to CV converter. Okay, I've got a pretty simple setup going here. I've got the laptop hooked up to the key step, and then I've got the key step hooked up to the Moog Mavis. Basically, I can play notes here, and the synth will sound out. And also, I can do some composition over on the computer and send MIDI notes to the key step, which will then send the notes on in CV format to the Moog Mavis. So first things first, I'm just going to try to pick a sound. I'm going to go with something that's a little bit more of a square wave, like midway between the two. And as you can see, I've turned the cutoff to about 50% position. And I'm actually going to make something a little percussive. I'm going to turn the sustain down. Another thing I like to do when I'm working with a monophonic synthesizer is I like to add delay. The reason I like to add delay to a monophonic synth is because those trails, those little ghost notes, make it seem like there's more than one synth playing at the same time. At this point, I'm just fooling around trying to come up with ideas. Okay, that works. Now that I've got a pattern I like, I'm going to record it as audio in Ableton. Next, I want a bass note. Simple enough. That's better. I could just play this for hours. Okay, let's record the audio for this. Okay, finally, it's time for a lead instrument. Let's try to combine oscillators here. Now I'm just going to tune it. Oh, it sounds really cool, actually. Okay. So just like that, we've taken these classic analog sounds and turned them into a little piece of music. So far, I'm really loving the Moog Mavis. It's an appealing product for me, not just because it has that classic Moog sound, but also because it's essentially a standalone Eurorack module. Obviously, the lack of MIDI is going to be a challenge for some setups. Personally, I'm really looking forward to integrating it with my synth setup over there and just taking advantage of that integration, maybe running some other oscillators into the Moog wave folder and filter, or running the Moog oscillator into the other stuff I have. In general, Moog Music is a very interesting company right now. The synths are built in a small building in Asheville, North Carolina, and the company is partly owned by its employees. On the one hand, they continue to innovate and release new products, but on the other hand, they're custodians of a legacy. After all, this is the original synthesizer company. The Mavis feels like it participates in that legacy. Designed to be an introduction to the magic and poetry of analog synthesis, its architecture can be directly traced back to Robert Moog's 1964 prototype. Okay, I think that's it. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it, it would be great if you could give me a thumbs up. And if you have not done so already, now is a great time to subscribe. I've got a bunch of videos on the way, and if you subscribe, you'll be notified whenever I make a new one. Also, there is a Patreon. It's $5 a month, and you get a sample library at the end of each month. This month, I'm actually going to be taking the Mavis out for a spin and putting it through a bunch of outboard effects, so look forward to that. See you soon.